good? Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. No, it's... Okay. Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome, policy enthusiasts, to our second last panel of the fall term. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Kevin Quigley. I'm the director of the MacEachen Institute for Public Policy and Government. So delighted to see yet again another strong turnout for this panel. I'm sure it's going to be a very interesting discussion. We start today by acknowledging Dalhousie University is located in MacEachen, the ancestral unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. We are all treaty people. I'll just make a quick announcement to note that next week will be our last panel for the fall, and the topic next week is Provincial Perspectives on Federal Pharmacare. And so we're looking forward to a very interesting discussion. And I think that's a subject also with a lot of momentum, and I think it's going to get a lot of coverage over the next 12 months, actually, questions of pharmacare. So I'm sure we'll have a very interesting discussion next week. I will also mention that we are partnering today with the Harris Center at Memorial University in Newfoundland. Delighted to partner with the Harris Center. They're doing some great work on public engagement, public policy research. I was delighted to attend a conference there last week, which was sensational, in their new center on Signal Hill. Bit of a walk for those of you who know Signal Hill, but it's a beautiful new spot, and they're doing lots of really interesting work on public engagement, and that was the theme of last week's conference, and I really had a great time, and I congratulate them for the great work they're doing. We're very delighted to partner with them on this talk, because of course something about seaport shipping and ports review of great significance to our community and also in Newfoundland, as well as significance, of course, right across the country when we talk about ports and port modernization. So, on the business of today's subject, the title of today's panel is Ports Modernization, Balancing Economic Prosperity and Environmental Sustainability. This panel aligns with our subject area of smart infrastructure. And I'll just say briefly, by way of introduction, that the sort of genesis of this panel started several months ago when we were talking about ports modernization, port efficiency, and shipping debates, and how we reconcile shipping debates and market demands with environmental concerns. And from that, we discussed with the panelists what kind of topic we might want to discuss on a panel, and the subject of the Ports Modernization Review emerged. Of course, it's very topical in Ottawa and here as well. And so we thought it was a great opportunity to explore the issue of the Ports Modernization Review. And we have a very distinguished group of panelists who have great insights into this subject. So I'm really looking forward to an excellent discussion. As is normally the case, I will introduce each panelist before they speak. And Tari will keep a watchful eye on the time. I think they've all been prompted 10 to 12 minutes. Is that right? It's 10 to 12 today? So 10 to 12 minutes for each speaker. And then following their opening statements, we'll go to the 5 students who have been designated to ask questions this week. And then we're going to open it up for community questions. So on that note, I'll introduce our first speaker, and that's Dr. Mary Brooks. Dr. Mary Brooks is a professor emerita at Dalhousie University's Rowe School of Business and a founding editor of Research in Transportation Business and Management. In 2016, she was appointed chair of the Marine Board of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. She recently chaired the Council of Canadian Academies' assessment of the value of commercial marine shipping to Canada. Her research focuses on competition policy in liner shipping, port strategic management, and short sea shipping. She's authored and published more than 25 books and technical reports, more than 25 book chapters, and more than 80 articles in peer-reviewed scholarly journals. She's a co-winner of the 2018 Onassis Prize in Shipping. Mary.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Kevin. I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. So the Port Modernization Review panel had 5 objectives. The box is supposed to be around the 5th objective. Today, I think we're probably only going to get a chance to talk about 2 of these. The third one is promoting environmentally sustainable infrastructure and operations. And the last one is optimizing governance and accountability, including with respect to financial management. So I'm going to focus on the last one of these, and Tony and Michelle are going to focus on the environmentally sustainable portion of this. Okay, just hang on a sec here. All right. So I thought I would start my talk by going back to the very beginning of thinking about port management and port governance and port policy. This field really did not take off until the 1980s. Richard Goss traveled the globe and looked at port governance and port reform in a number of countries. Canada was one of the ones who benefited from him visiting here, and he did a report for the Canadian Transportation Commission. By 1990, he had consolidated all of his learnings from his global work into 4 principles that he put up as being the principles by which ports should be managed in countries. Essentially, he said their primary purpose is to serve trade, and that trade then generates knock-on effects for per capita wealth generation for citizens. So this is about what the role of ports should be anywhere in the world. The second principle that he had was that we create a competitive environment so that efficiency gains are passed on and the country is better served. Tight regulation doesn't work. So you don't want to be too hands-on as a government. And I think you'll hear later that I believe that's where we're already failing, is the government has too much in terms of its hands on the way ports work in this country. Third was that port reform needs to reflect the differences that a country brings to the table. And that difference grows out of its history, its geography, and his conclusion is there is no one right way. So you can't do a one-size-fits-all policy. And in his work, he used examples of Hong Kong and Singapore as successful ports with very different models. And he saw that in Canada, we had a lot of geographic differences that would mean that one policy was not going to work for all Canadian ports. Then he said that some countries would be better served by landlord models, which is pretty much the Canadian model, while others will find that public service strategies or full privatization will work better. So we have countries in the world today that are fully privatized, and we have countries where there's a fully public service model in place, and then we have a mixed bag everywhere else. So focusing on the Canadian situation, back in 1994, the Canadian government began the process of developing a ports policy for Canada. And by 1998, they had passed the legislation to do that, and that was the Canada Marine Act. In that legislation, they dictated that there would be strategic national ports. They called these Canada Port Authority ports, and there are 18 of them. These ports are set out as non-recourse, non-share capital entities. The Government of Canada is not a shareholder. The Government of Canada owns the land and the assets. They are eligible to apply today for whatever kind of gateway funding the government of the day should choose to introduce, or other government support, but they are not financially able to draw down on government funding other than through programs the government might design. They also decided that there were an awful lot of ports on the books that should be demolished, and they've done that. And they decided that there would be ports that they would deproclaim. That just means they say there's a port doesn't exist. Those ports still exist. They're still being used, but they're not listed as ports in Canada. I'm not quite sure how that works, but in any case, we do have some fairly large deproclaimed ports in this country. The group that they decided they were not going to support strategically, they then devolved to local governments or other agencies, other government departments. Fisheries and Oceans took some, and so on. These ports get no financial support from the Government of Canada. There are 327 of them as of last year. And those 327 include ports like Port Hawkesbury, Sydney, and so on. And then last but not least, the government decided that it had a public service obligation to remote ports in communities that had no other access for the delivery of goods, food, that kind of thing. Ports like Bella Bella on the coast of BC, those kinds of Arctic ports. So if we think about some background information on these 18 that are federal agencies that the Minister of Transport has under his oversight, we have the Port of Vancouver, which accounted for 38% of all revenue to Canadian port authorities. So one port accounts for 38% of the revenue from 18. And if you look at the revenue overall, 6 ports account for 88% of Port Authority revenue and 85% of Port Authority expenditure. That tells me that there are 12 ports out there that we should be asking, okay, what is their national strategic purpose? Because that's the criteria for inclusion. There is no indication of what that criteria is. We are not told what the criteria should be. And now, in this port modernization review, there is no discussion of what the criteria should be. One of the ports I've signaled just to use as an illustration, and I'm sure that the Port of Oshawa is not happy with me about this, but in 2011, and you'll love this, the last year that Statistics Canada thought it was important to collect information on port traffic and publish it, because they don't collect it anymore, only Transport Canada collects it, the Port of Oshawa was not even in the top 50. Does that make it a strategic port? I'm now really questioning what its purpose is. So the way that the minister controls ports, even though they're supposedly independent, financially self-sufficient federal agencies, is that it's through the appointment of port boards of directors. And those boards of directors are chosen by the board of directors are chosen by the minister. So the official background document says directors are stewards acting in the best interests of the CPA, 1 municipal appointee, 1 provincial appointee, 1 governor and council, that's federal appointee, and 4 to 7 appointees recommended by port users. But the minister chooses. The port users only get to talk about possible names. Now, earlier governance that was put in place at airports, so airports preceded ports in this process, had less potential for political interference by the minister because their boards consist of 10 directors that are appointed by nominating entities, 1 federal, 2 provincial. In Halifax, it's 4 municipal because back at the time when we had Halifax, Dartmouth, Bedford, Sackville County, and they merged 2 of those. And the Chamber of Commerce was chosen as the entity to appoint 3 business people. So interesting that chambers of commerce were put in. But the most important thing here is that 3 were appointed by the board themselves. And that's, I think, the big issue. So seeing as I wasted a fair bit of time on the front end, I think I need to move very quickly now. Oops, sorry. So I'd like to just end this discussion. I'd like to end this discussion with, it's not going to stop, is it? Good, thank you. So the thing that I think is most important is that we do not have consistent, standardized, market-acceptable governance practices in places in our ports. For example, my 2017 study looked at governance standards produced by the TSX for a publicly traded company that's protecting shareholder interests, and then applied those to ports across the country. Only 1 CPA, and I'll say who that is, Vancouver, met the practices that are acceptable for entities reporting to shareholders. 8 out of the 18 CPAs didn't even bother to list the committees of their boards of directors and who those members were. 2 did not provide publicly accessible annual reports. This is really, in my view as a taxpayer, this is not acceptable. There is no, or I'll say very little, it's very poor enforcement by the government. Not all the ports report individual board member fees, which is in the legislation. So they're not even living up to the standards of the legislation, and half of them haven't adopted practices that would meet the private sector market. My conclusion was they're casual in their dealings with community consultation. Airports are required to report, but ports are not, so my question is why? And so I have a list here of where governance needs to work better. It includes things like meeting standards for reporting. We're going to have Tony and Michelle talk further about environmental reporting. They don't measure port performance in a way that needs to be done. They don't have a plan that's well understood for monitoring, enforcement, and compliance, and there's still too much political interference. Governments around the world see ports as cash cows to be harvested financially. So I'm going to end with a set of questions here. My time is up, I'm told, and I really just hope that we can come back to these questions at the end, and you will hear from Tony and Michelle on the environmental and sustainability reporting and corporate social responsibility, and Jim will bring up the end of the panel with his discussion on his views on what he's heard today. Thank you. Oh, it is.
I think we just scroll to the top.
Yes, it is. I was just going to do that for you.
Sure.
You can introduce Tony, and I'll fix this while you're doing that.
Tony Walker. So Tony Walker is an assistant professor at the School of Resource and Environmental Studies at Dalhousie University. He has over 25 years of research and consulting experience in resource and environmental management. Tony previously worked in industry for a decade as an environmental consultant, specializing in monitoring and management of contaminants in marine and terrestrial ecosystems. One of Tony's recent research interests is focused on improving management, sustainability, and the policy related to environmental impacts and marine transportation. He did his PhD at the University of Nottingham, UK, studying terrestrial pollution in the Russian Arctic arising from resource extractive industries. Tony Walker.
Okay, thank you very much. So yeah, I have a few slides, and I know I'm going to get timed officially today, so hopefully I'll be on time. But everything Mary was saying, oh, I've got an example of that, or I can support that, you know, from my time in consulting, working for ports. But anyway, we can get to that in the discussion side of things. So a couple of years ago, as a relatively new prof here at Dal, I decided to take a summer just having a look at performance indicators in North American ports. And for those of you who've probably been assigned or taken the initiative to do the reading that was assigned, the Green Marine Environmental Performance Program is one that all of the 18 Canadian port authorities undertake, and it's also done by many North American ports as well. So we'll dive into that. So Green Marine is a voluntary environmental performance program that ports and ship owners as well. So this is not just exclusive to ports only, but shipping companies can sign on to this. And because it is voluntary, there's no government interference, you would think, by that. And so Green Marine is one example within the global performance indicators for marine shipping, and it's unique to North America. But what's interesting about it, like a lot of these voluntary programs, they're self-assessed. And so for those of you who are probably familiar with other similar programs like the Marine Stewardship Council, you know, for seafood, or the Forestry Stewardship Council, a lot of these self-reporting certifications have limitations, you know, pros and cons. But this was designed to measure environmental performance of ports or shipping companies or other marine transportation affiliates. And so I'll talk about them in a little while, but there's a bunch of performance indicators, many of which you will be familiar with. But what they need to do once they sign on to this program is establish a baseline, and again, self-report it. It's made publicly available, so this is at least somewhere where ports can actually be responsive and then put their information out through the Green Marine Program. And results are verified by independent auditors. So that would be people or persons with the relevant expertise in these environmental performance indicator metrics, and they go around and make sure and verify that the ports or ship companies have actually done what they said they'd done, and reported what they said they were going to report on. So measurable. And the idea behind Green Marine is it's supposed to exceed both local, national, regional, and international regulations. So it's not just meeting the bare minimum, it's supposed to go above and beyond. So it sounds really wonderful. It's the best thing since sliced bread. But when we take a look later on, we'll actually have a look at some of the limitations. So for North America, the Green Marine Program was established in 2007, so it's relatively recent. We've got about 11 years on the books. In fact, it's more like 10, because the 2007 data wasn't officially reported until later on in 2008. So it's about a decade old. It's not very mature when compared with counterparts or similar programs in Europe. And we might not get into it in today's talk because we're dealing with policy of Canadian ports. But in Europe, they're fairly advanced with this, and there are some stellar examples of European ports exceeding these standards. So, and I've already mentioned that the participants in Green Marine include shipping companies, ports, and conveniently, all of the 18 CPAs are signed up and are members of the Green Marine Program. And then there's seaway corporations and terminals as well. So terminals would be like coal or dry bulk unloading and loading facilities. And there's numerous examples of that in North America and including Canada. So this is a presentation I gave a couple of years ago, and that is a list of the performance indicators at that time. One of the drawbacks to the Green Marine Program is, I think this one lists 11 indicators or metrics. And over the years, they've dropped some and then added others, which makes it very difficult over time to measure performance, because you can't look back and have interannual comparison when they keep changing the goalposts. Just to give you an example here, all the stuff listed in green is relevant to ship owners, so that's like the Maersks and all those sorts of companies that operate here in North America. But then the stuff in blue are the metrics which ports and terminals are measured against. So, for example, community impacts. And we've already heard about Mary talking about how sometimes they're not that transparent on how they communicate what they do with the communities. Dry bulk handling and storage, environmental leadership, greenhouse gas emissions, and prevention of spills and leakages. And so the metrics are measured against a 1 to 5 scale, and here you can see how that's listed. So number 1 is the basic bare minimum, so meeting environmental regulations. If you've done that, you get a score of 1. Right up through the leaderboard up to excellence and leadership. So 4, you would have to show and provide examples of innovation and using technologies. So that could be a case of like implementing ship-to-shore power. So basically you've got a large electrical socket where ships can come ashore, like cruise ships, and plug into the grid. And then 5 is showing excellence and leadership. Probably you're the first one to adopt a certain technology to maintain 5. So this is not fantastic in terms of its resolution, but what I'm trying to show you here, this is not just Canadian ports. This is also mixed in with other North American ports. So you've got ports in the US, but this is a 1 to 5 point scorecard listing all the different performance indicators. But as a member of the public, you see, I think it's listed alphabetically. I guess that's the way they do it. But I looked at this and I thought, well, how are Canadian ports ranked within this leaderboard? Because it's very difficult to see who's on top. And again, the font on this is pretty small, but if you did the reading, you'll probably see this table in there. I believe it was table, I don't know. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Essentially what I did, I ranked it based on average or mean score for all of those performance indicators. And the top 3 are Canadian ports. And the top one is the Port of Halifax. Rah, rah. So that's excellent. It is. It's excellent based on the way that these things are measured. So that is fantastic, and it's nice and consistent that we've got 3 Canadian ports listed. This is of 2016. In fact, the average scores have gone up since then. However, this is what it looks like over time for all of the green marine ports. So this is the median. I think everybody logged on back in 2007 and 8 with a fairly low score of 2, and it's steadily climbed. I think the average score for all of the ports are now slightly higher than that. And as you can see on the left-hand side, the original 11 performance indicators look to be fairly comprehensive, but then as issues arise with marine transportation and ports, underwater noise has been subsequently added, because we all know what happens to marine mammals and underwater noise. And shoreside waste management, because, you know, if improperly handled, we know what happens to mismanaged waste, don't we, Riley? So these things have been added and some other things have been taken away. So again, it's moving goalposts, responding to concerns, both in the industry but also by governments and society in general. So remember I told you that that the top ports performing based on those metrics in 2016 with 3 Canadian ports, and the top one was Halifax. So again, that's fantastic if you take that at face value. Another study, Michelle's student, and I was on the committee of this student, he's since graduated. But anyway, this article is now under review in Marine Policy. He took another way at looking at Canadian CPAs, so those 18 ports that Mary was talking about and why we're here today. And said, okay, well, if you look at sustainability and other performance metrics that he gathered from around the globe, and he chose 25 standard performance metrics and compared the Canadian ports against these, and you see a bit of a discrepancy. So Halifax, which is number 1 on this particular thing, doesn't have on its publicly available website any reporting related to sustainability, nor does it have anything related to incorporating global reporting initiative, like that's a global sustainability reporting indicator metric. It's standardized across other sectors and other industries. Halifax doesn't have any of that. The good news is the Port of Montreal, which was listed as number 2 in the performance metrics of Green Marine, does. So that reports sustainability metrics. So it looks at the way it performs environmentally in a different way, and so does Vancouver. So whilst Halifax may be considered the best of the best in green marine, there are still some limitations. And this, the top line there, shows all of the 18 CPAs that are subscribed or are voluntary, subscribed to the voluntary program Green Marine. It's 100% of them. But if you look down the long list of various sustainability metrics and other environmental performance indicators, it's a bit patchy, ranging from 0 to 10 or 70%. So there's still a ways to go for the CPAs here in Canada. And whilst we might be doing a fantastic job, there's folks in the audience that have worked on this organism. Does anybody know what this is? Yes. So the marine shipping industry in Canada, and of course I'm not picking on just the ports here, but the ports host the ships. These guys are still getting whacked, yet apparently we're still getting great performance metrics on these scorecards. So there's still a little ways to go and how to rationalize that, but we will discuss that. So I think the Green Marine program in and of itself is a good way to benchmark performance. But there are still some metrics and indicators that could be included, such as sustainability reporting and getting in line with other internationally recognized metrics. And in order to do that, that would actually, keep Canadian ports lean and mean in order to compete on the international marketplace, because after all, 90% of our goods travel in and out of ports and via marine transportation, thanks to globalization. So I think I am done. Time's up. Perfect. Thanks. Now we need to find Michelle's slides. Yeah.
So
She must be after all of them.
she must be third.
This one, I
that right?
believe. Yeah,
go.
look at that font.
Oh, okay. So it
Is
got
that your
embed-
font?
We
It
figured
got,
it out.
it got embedded into everything, I see.
I'm going to introduce you.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
changed all of the,
So Dr. Michelle Adams is the interim director and associate professor with the School for Resource and Environmental Studies at Dalhousie University and a research fellow at the Verschuren Center for Sustainability, Energy, and the Environment. Her scholarly research focuses on industrial ecology, energy policy, and sustainability strategies for business and industrial operations. She also has a long history of applied research in outward-facing context, with the primary objective of addressing socioeconomic and policy barriers linked to the integration of resource efficiency and sustainable technology into industrial operations. Dr. Adams is a professional engineer and former naval officer who holds a PhD in chemical engineering from Dalhousie University. Michelle.
I'm not sure what's going on with the font, so, forgive me if it looks a little bit like my 7-year-old took his crayons. Anyway, we'll just see where we're going here. Thank you very much. So I'm going to try to wrap, my professorly way, I'm going to try to kind of wrap us back around to finish off sort of where we started with this idea around governance. And so you'll kind of see how this, and then Jim is going to pick up as the rabble-rouser, kind of poking at us as we continue. So one of the things that I wanted to do when we're talking about sustainability is, we're doing a port modernization review, but I wanted to kind of provide, essentially the context, the backdrop, if you will, of the kind of the policy climate that we're living in, because, of course, in these days, nothing can be taken in a siloed way. We have to look at these kinds of initiatives in the broader context. And in the broader context for port modernization, we're looking at things like the fact that I've got a number of quotes in here, but this is one, the world container traffic is expected to keep growing substantially along with increase in world trade and continuing rapid economic growth in the developing world. So, what does actually that mean and why do we care? So I want to just point out this graph here that notes essentially kind of the parallel trajectory, if you will, not quite parallel, but you see in terms of the direction between global trade and GDP. So I just want you to keep that kind of in the back of your mind of, okay, so as GDP goes up, so trade is going up as well. And obviously, ports are looking at this through the lens of we want, trade to continue. We want it to expand. Obviously, growth is good, as we say. But then I also want to bring you to this, and you're thinking, okay, what's this got to do with ports? What I want you to look at here is the GDP line. So what we're trying, this is where my clicker, see, I'm hand waving, but anyway. So you'll see this black line, that's again our GDP line. What I want you to take away from this is this connection, and this connection here is basically consumption. So consumption of ores, fossil fuels, construction materials, biomass, it's our resource consumption. And this is also linked to essentially environmental degradation. So if we plotted environmental degradation on there, you'd see a very similar trajectory. So what we need to do in a broader sustainability sense is we need to decouple this. We need to separate this GDP line and our resource consumptions. So obviously, if as ports we want to continue to grow, we want world trade to continue to grow, and we notice that there's this link between GDP. There is we basically have a role to play along with every other sector in trying to decouple this. And so what does that look like in general is this notion of efficient use of resources. So a port, like any other industry, has to look at how it's using its resources, how it's using energy, how it's actually interacting with the material flows that exist within its borders. And the two reasons we want to do that is we have the reduction of the resource use, which links to the consumption, but it's also linked to the environmental impacts associated with this. So if you think of resource as things like emissions, because obviously if you reduce the amount of resources you're using, you're also reducing the amount of emissions per capita, because essentially what is waste? Waste is a resource that came into your system and went out the other end without being used properly. Environmental impacts are the things that impact, are those things that would affect your ecosystems around your port operations. So therefore, if we're going to start to address these kinds of broader issues, we're looking at, essentially a new multifunctional approach for the operation of ports are required. And I, refer to Van Westenbach to this. So what does this mean? It means that we actually need to start addressing more than just essentially the kind of basic environmental issues of, emissions. We have to look at things in more broadly. And again, we're dealing with, kind of befuddled font here. But essentially the idea of, we've got, the biophysical world, which is our surrounding ecosystem. So that's the receiving environment that we have to look after. But also importantly embedded in there is the society. So that's our stakeholders. That's the communities that are around those ports. And then of course embedded within that is the economy or the port as a center of commerce and trade. We don't want to take that away. So this, we're looking at how we can use this notion of sustainability to move away from this notion of the mutually exclusive idea that we've kind of had for a number of years coming into the present, of environment and economics being at odds with each other. So I just want to come back to this. What Tony just addressed quickly is this is green is a good place to start. So this is the green marine trajectory, and you'll notice here that again, Halifax is at the top. And to just put a finer point on this, it doesn't, as Tony mentioned, it doesn't equal sustainability. And the reason I just want to point this out here is this other graph is essentially looking at port sustainability. This is the output of the study that Tony referred to. And even though the Port of Halifax, again, is number one on green marine, but we will look at it through the broader sustainability lens of stakeholder engagement and reporting, governance, things like this, that it actually kind of comes in at the moderate. So it makes you realize that there's more to this, story. So if we look at, we look at achieving sustainable maritime transportation requires an enlarging scope of sustainability beyond emissions. We have to go beyond, essentially greenhouse gas emission discussions. That's important, but that's not all that we need to be talking about when we talk about sustainability. There is more to that. We have to look at it about how marine business transactions are carried out. So what does that mean? That actually means that we actually need to balance, essentially ports can be our coastal stewards, but also they're facilitators of commerce and transportation, but they're also members of their respective societies. So this is these three pillars, if you will. So this, if we're looking at trying to enable our ports through this port modernization review, if we're looking at trying to make our Canadian ports, balanced as coastal stewards, facilitators of commerce, and members of the respective community, we're dealing with our three pillars: our environment, our economics, and our society. I'll bring you back to the port here, the graph here, that again, just noting the fact that of all of our CPAs, only 3 actually engage in this kind of broader sustainability evaluation, or at least make it available to the public. And what is I don't want you to actually read this. What I'm basically trying to, this is really interesting font. I'm going to have to practice drawing with my son when I get home. But it's like basically ports are very complex, but the thing is they're also multivariate. They're multivariate organizations that have multifaceted stakeholders, and CSR. In a private sector situation is generally, kind of an autonomous operation. The challenge that I think one of the reasons we're seeing things that look like this is when we actually start trying to look at sustainability and corporate social responsibility, or CSR, in a port context, is they're not actually the same as an autonomous private sector. They have essentially multiple taskmasters in many ways when it comes to these kinds of reporting. So, for example, in private sector, there's been this acceptance of financial performance over socio-environmental, and that's been a challenge over time. However, in contrast, if we are actually moving forward and trying to see our ports as also members of our community, and also having a role, especially considering that they are extensions of the Government of Canada, there is actually a responsibility to move beyond and to move into this more kind of three-pillared space. So governance models for sustainable development, a new proactive paradigm. And I just want to one of the things I just want to kind of bring here is that if we're going to look at how to bring ports into the kind of, the 21st century, we really do need, oh my God, this is terrible. Sorry, guys. We really do need, these three elements, because if you actually look at some of the issues that we're facing, we have essentially, there's the ideas of protecting of ecosystem services, and obviously not wanting to negatively impact your surrounding environment. But then we also, have, again, the economic and social elements. And when you come to things like social elements, transparency and the prioritization of stakeholder engagement is an inherent part of the sustainability process. It is an inherent part of the corporate social responsibility model, if you will. Part of the thing that literature also shows us is that the more we embrace these three pillars, it has a direct reflection and a direct relationship to this notion of social license to operate. Now, that might not be a major challenge for a lot of the ports right now, but if you actually look at some of the conditions and motivations as to why the European ports, for example, find themselves in the position they are as sustainability leaders, in some cases this actually emerged as necessity. If you look at, sort of the 10 largest city ports or port cities, on the planet, they have 72 million people living right around them, kind of looking at, watching what they're doing. Canada, we've maybe get away with that a little bit because we don't have some of that population density. But over time, and it's of course whether it's social media, as the expectation of our youth, the things that perhaps we've been able to get away with before are going to become more of a challenge, and the social license issue will become more of a challenge as well. So I guess I got 1 minute left. So my takeaway message from this is 4 points. The first is that the business case for sustainability is not the business case for green. There's more to it. That's, just keep that in mind. Green marine is a good place to start. There's more to it. Increasingly, the notion of good governance is in sustainability, CSR. These are increasingly kind of seen as somewhat interchangeable. You can't have a good sustainability model. You can't have a good corporate social responsibility strategy embedded into your organization and not have good governance. They go hand in hand. The transparency, the operations, the metrics. Social environmental issues are not add-ons. That's the other, my third takeaway. These are things that actually become embedded in the process, and as such should be embedded in any port modernization that we're looking at. They shouldn't be seen as kind of afterthoughts. These kinds of things need to be embedded in the process. They need to be embedded within the silo, if you will. And I guess the final thing is port modernization since the integration of comprehensive CSR expectations into the management structures, because if they do, the CSR management structures are essentially, available. They are not. You're not reinventing the wheel. There are lots. There's lots of opportunity to integrate this. Those models are there, and it should be something that we should be considering as we move forward. Thank you.
Captain Jim Parsons is the Academic Director for the Master of Marine Management Graduate Program at the Marine Institute of Memorial University. He is a member of the Executive Council for the Canadian Network of Expertise for Transportation in Arctic Waters, a member of the Transportation Appeal Tribunal of Canada, an Associate Fellow of the Nautical Institute and representative at IMO, and Canada's civilian expert at NATO's transport group Ocean Shipping. Since 2004, he's been the owner of Global Marine Solutions Incorporated, a consulting company based in St. John's. He holds a PhD in Marine Transportation Economics from the University of Plymouth. Jim.
Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be here. I'm currently not the at Memorial. I'm on leave, so I'm not the academic director for the master's program right now. I'm on a bit of a leave living in Ottawa. So for the record there, that's all. Now, how to corral this mob I have in front of me right here. All right. So obviously I couldn't prepare a PowerPoint presentation because it was kind of like, this is a surprise. So I was listening and frantically taking notes. So as a mariner, a former mariner, I've traveled, many of the major ports. I've been into many of the major ports in the world, and I know from a ship operator's perspective, what a port means to us as mariners. All right, and so there's a lot of need that a ship and a shipping company and a ship owner have. I'm probably going to be jumping all over the place here because I'm not going to be looking down too much at my notes. I'm just trying to reflect upon what was said, and I'll kind of work my way over across, starting with Mary. But historically, if you look back, ports were created out of need. So if you look at many of the major ports in the world, they're at the entrance to a river or the mouth of a river or something like that there, and it was a physical function of trying to get goods to people. All right, so people stayed over for the winters, the population grew, but it was always around shipping and the port. So in terms of port modernization, I mean, like if you look at, and Mary was getting on with the financial ability side of it all. When I was doing my PhD, a lot of my research looked at P3 arrangements, so the public-private partnership. So I want to change the P3 arrangement here to public port partnerships, right? Because or political, I should say, port partnerships, right? Not public. It's and a lot of politics. So I think in many cases the market is best left alone. The free market, if you leave it alone and take politics away from it, the competitive nature of the area may be the best solution. And I see a role for government in that it may be like a parent, help the child get a foundation, get it started, and then cut the apron string and let the child go out to nature and let it see what happens. Because if you keep propping it up, it's going to be forever dependent on the apron strings and the parent and the government. So you have to like cut it loose and let it sink or swim, right? So I firmly support Mary in that politics there's a time and place for it, and maybe sometimes, because you have to think about ports like shipbuilding are great employer stimulants. So, what we'll end up doing in the shipping industry, we'll keep building ships because it employs a lot of people, but then we flood the market with a surplus of ships, which drives the freight rates down, and at the end of the day, none of the ship owners can survive. The consumer may like it because it's a very affordable way to transport, but at the end of the day, then when you have these fly-in, fly-out, or fly-by-night operations, in the long run, it actually may hurt the consumer because you don't have reliability and the repeatability of good service. So that's my little comeback to Mary, and I think that yes, anybody who's getting government money needs to be fiscally and financially accountable, and it should be put out there for people to see. So the last thing there then, ports, the politics of ports should stay out of it, and it should not be looked at as some appointment and okay, we'll create some employment here because it's needed because there's an election coming up or something like that there. That needs to certainly come out of the way, right? I come from Newfoundland, so when there's an election, what happens? All the roads get paved, right? So, and I'm sure it's the same everywhere, but politics, there's a time and place for it, and I'll stop at that. So for Tony, with from the environmental sustainability side of it on, Green Marine, a great organization, and not only are there ports and ship owners, but there are also maritime schools that are members of Green Marine also. And I'm a member of the Master Mariners of Canada, and in September, we had a symposium in St. John, New Brunswick, and it was all about technology and sharing our waters, ships and whales, not Chip and Dales, ships and whales. And and Green Marine gave a presentation. The one thing I want to that with Tony, and this may be something maybe we could talk about it later, but the connection with the right whales and the ports. I can see the connection with the right whales and the ships on their matrices, but I don't know. I mean, I used to run a cruise ship at a St. John's Harbor, and there were two whales there, two humpback whales that were meeting me every trip, 3 trips a day for almost 10 days. People would come to me and say, "Are we going to see any whales?" And I'd say to them, "Listen, if we don't see whales at Fort Amherst, I'll give you your money back." Right? And there was a mother and her calf waiting for us there every trip that we went out, and we would stop the engine and we would sail, and then one would come up on the port bow and the other on the starboard bow, and they would just blow. So if you haven't been snot on by a whale, you really haven't been whale watching, all right? And it was beautiful to go on the bowsprit, and you could put a hand down almost over the blowhole of each of these and let it come up at you, all right? So, but that's the ship owner. But so they haven't gone into the ports, Tony. So, maybe they should stay out of the ports anyway. But in terms of matrices, I mean, I think it was Aristotle said that before you can measure something, before you can manage something, you must be able to measure it. And if it's not measurable, then make it measurable and then manage it. All right. So, so yes, we all need something, a benchmark, to be able to check off and say we've done that and done that and done that. I think what the ports need to do, and no doubt some of them already are, and they're getting away from the political game. They're getting more into their customer approach and looking at what it is these ships of today, and more so the ships of the future, will need. What services will these ships need? What services will these ships need? And so if you look at the way technology is changing now, and the responsibilities and the requirements that ships are having to adhere to, then make sure that the ports are able to service the ships, because if not, they're going to go somewhere else. All right. Dredging is a big thing with ports. You know, water depth. So a lot of these major rivers, the Hudson River, for example, New York and places built on a river, a lot of dredging takes place. Dredging is very costly. All right. So, but because the infrastructure is already set up there, would it be sustainable or fiscally sound or sensible to move it somewhere else where there's naturally deep water? Maybe the politics won't let that happen, all right? But if you think about the common sense of it all, yes, it shouldn't be there, right? There are airports in the world, Newfoundland, lots of places where they shouldn't be, but they're there because of political reasons, right? And that kind of gets to me. And the same way with ports, it shouldn't be like that. Let the market decide where these things are going to be. What else can I rant on about that? So the IMO constantly puts demands on vessel owners, ballast water, fuel emissions, and all this kind of stuff. Well, the ports, there was a case in Newfoundland, for example, back when single-skin ships were on the go, dirty ballast water. Right? Now, you weren't allowed to discharge this stuff, and you go to ports open that there were port reception facilities to take this slop from the ships. Many places are not set up. They don't want to bother with that business, so they don't take it. So if the ship owner now, the tanks are getting full, I can't get rid of this stuff. You know, if your garbage bins are full in your house and the garbage truck is not coming around, what are you going to do with your garbage? You're going to take it to Walmart, throw it in their dumpster. You're going to throw it somewhere else wherever you can find an empty dumpster, right? Or you're going to take it up in the side road and throw it out in the forest somewhere. Well, ship owners will do the same. Right? Not all of them, but some will. So you have to provide them with the services that they need, all right? And that has to be connected with what IMO was mandating these ships must do in the future, right? Coming in now with the sulfur caps in the 2020 and the HFO ban in the Arctic. If you don't put the resources in place that these ships can carry on doing their business, they're not going to be able to do it, or going to find cut corners, and then the environment may suffer eventually, all right? So it needs to be, it's a big machine, and it needs to be all connected. And that kind of segues into Michelle, So ports are complex. Yes, they are, and they, you know, you need a lot of population to. It's like anything, I suppose. You go to a smaller airport, smaller areas in rural, you have smaller airports and smaller ports. It's like you need a big population to be able to sustain what's happening in a port. And so therefore maybe consolidation needs to happen. That goes back to what Mary said. Maybe we don't really need all these ports if you really get down to the brass tacks of it and solve why is this port here anyway, right? I mean, there are many ports in some parts of the country that are still owned by Transport Canada. And there's a trend there. And you have to ask, why are these 6 or 7 ports in one particular province still owned by Transport Canada? Right? And corporate social responsibility, yeah, it's great, but it has to be done for the right reasons, okay? It doesn't, if it's done for the sake of saying that we're doing it because it's another checkbox, it's a matrix, then it's wrong. It's the wrong approach. It has to be inherently something that you feel should be done, and not because it must be done or has to be done. Is because you want it to be done. Okay, I think that's it. I think we have some time for questions and later on some engagements. Again, you have to remember I am from Newfoundland, so we can talk all day. But the interesting part is, you know, sometimes you know what you know, but you want to know what other people know. So we have any other speakers, but I guess we're going to have some more questions. So we'll leave it at that, and we'll roll up our sleeves and get messy.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jim. We have questions coming from students, which we're going to take in a second. I'm going to give everybody 1 minute tops, the three panelists, to respond to Jim's comments if you'd like to take it. You can always waive it. But if you want to, do you want to take a minute? No, Cindy, no, you're mic'd here at the table, so it's okay. Can you just lower your screen, Tony? Yeah, that'd be great. 1 minute each, though, max, okay?
Okay, I like the fact that Jim has raised the question about why is Transport Canada still owning some ports in some places? And in particular, we're talking about ports that they originally said would be divested, and here we are 20 years later, and there's still some problems with walking away from some of the assets that are difficult. On the other hand, I love the fact that Canada is pretty much alone in terms of most of the countries out there that our remote ports deserve to be retained as public service obligations. We have enough trouble feeding people in the north that we don't need to be saying, you're really on your own now. So we think about being Canadians, you know, we need to look after the least, the least advantaged, but we also need to make sure that we aren't squandering valuable taxpayer resources on things that we should not be supporting. So to me, there is a broader discussion here. I have to say that I'm disappointed that this port modernization review is just looking at 18 CPA ports, and it's not looking at the whole of port policy in Canada.
Tony.
Yeah, I totally agree with Jim. Wales, or certainly the North Atlantic right Wales, are not getting impacted by the ports, but like you said, though, they are interconnected with the shipping industry, and on the occasions where the ships have mandatory or voluntary speed restrictions, that's going to impact offload and delivery time in the ports, and maybe ports and the ships would hopefully coordinate that a little bit better in the future, and maybe that's where we're going, so I'd like to see that.
Great, Michelle.
I'd just like to pick up then on essentially Jim's final comment about, you know, CSR and being something that's being done for the right reasons, because ultimately it can't be just a marketing campaign, because that's really what CSR up to now has been in a lot of cases, not just ports but in general. Whereas I mean, if we're coming back to Mary's comments about, you know, why do we have some of these ports? Why, you know, are they the best? Are they the best locations? Should they be there? One of the things about having a very, very strong governance structure that looks at the three pillars is you will actually start to develop the data, if you will, to actually start to make a decision. Like if we have this port here, well, if you're looking at it, especially from Transport Canada's perspective, where you're looking at this collectively, why do we have this port here? You know, the greenhouse gas emissions associated with going through this port to get to, you know, community A, we'd be better off going here and throwing it on a train. And unless you have those data, you can't actually start making those kinds of decisions. And essentially the CSR frameworks that force you to start to consider those kind of broader metrics, I think is a good place to start. But again, it can't just be done because we want to say, oh look, we have a sustainability report. That's not the intention.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thanks to the panelists.
Do I have 10 seconds?
9.
Okay.
8.
I was going to talk about port infrastructure in the Arctic, but it wouldn't take me very long anyway to talk about it. But that's a debate that we need to have also.
We're going to have a question about the Arctic.
Okay.
I think it's coming
Cool.
from the students. Okay.
That was 5 seconds. I have 5.
We're going to pivot now and ask our students. So we have 5 students who prepared questions, and we'll start with Laura Bartlett.
Hi, my name is Laura Bartlett. I'm a second-year Master of Resource and Environmental Management student. My question's for Mary. It seems like having fewer, more transparent CPAs might be the best way forward. However, by reducing the number of CPAs and concentrating shipping at those ports, it could potentially increase the negative environmental impacts at those ports and also negatively impact both socially and economically those ports that lose their CPA status. So I'm wondering if the benefits of fewer, better managed CPAs outweighs the potential negative impacts of concentrating the number of CPAs.
I think actually there's an assumption implicit that if one is not a CPA port, then one is not a port. A CPA port is a port that is a federal agency and is eligible to attract federal funds, should there be a program available, but otherwise is left to run as a port. As I said, there are proclaimed ports that are still functioning as ports. There are ports that have been transferred to local entities that are still ports. So there isn't a tie that the traffic will move somewhere else. The traffic will still be handled wherever the traffic chooses to go. So all I'm asking is that if we have ports which the federal government chooses to retain as federal agencies, that they be required to meet transparency and reporting standards that citizens and taxpayers expect should be there. In other words, there needs to be transparency, and it doesn't exist right now for many of those ports. I guess my initial point was the Port of Vancouver was the only one that would meet a publicly traded company's set of standards by what they produce for their public audience.
Thanks, Mary. I'm going to just remind everybody that when we're in Q&A, the students have prepared questions for specific panelists, so they're asked to direct the question rather than ask everybody and thereby expand the number of answers. And we want to get through as many questions as we can, so each of the students have prepared a question for someone in particular. Now we're going to go to Simone Charon.
Hi, I'm Simone Charon. I am a Master's of Resource and Environmental Management student in second year. And my question is for Michelle. And Michelle, I've modified this a bit based on what you said. You were mentioning how we need to expand the conversation much beyond just reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So my question relates to federal carbon pricing that was announced last week. And it's about recognizing that carbon pricing will be applied through a carbon levy on operations at ports, but also marine shipping companies, excuse me. Do you believe that carbon pricing as a measure can influence broader sustainability measures like the ones that you're mentioning, either in environment but also social and economic realms?
Okay. As with all of these things, I will always, with any of these kind of what I call complex or wicked problems, it's going to be, it depends. I mean, the inherent nature of marine shipping is that it's kind of multi-jurisdictional. So what happens in Canada doesn't necessarily mean what happens in, the US or what have you. Now, having said that, the Europeans have had a European trading scheme for a while around carbon. The one thing that you may find that this pushes, and I guess we'll see how it plays out. There's a number of ports who still have not embraced the construction of facilities for LNG or the for ships. There's a number of ships that haven't made that transition. Obviously, the carbon levy on something like LNG would be in terms of the per kilojoule output of energy coming out of that will be lower than it would be for bunker C or oil and these kinds of things. So perhaps you may see influence from that perspective, that because obviously the fuel will be cheaper in terms of the carbon associated with it. Now, what other market forces impact that? So that in itself would have carryover effects. Whether are they positive or negative? You're going to have positive effects perhaps if you're making a transition to a lower carbon fuel. If you have transition to, you start attracting, those ships that actually have converted to LNG, so now they can come to the Port of Halifax, for example, versus somewhere else because they are an LNG facility or they are an LNG ship. But again, like will the carryover happen overnight? No, and unfortunately, as a crystal ball, will that shove that in that direction? I can't say, but I would hope that there is that potential.
Mary McGowan.
Hi, my question's for Jim. Got a bit of an opportunity for you to expand on the Arctic shipping comment. My question's about that Arctic shipping, is likely to experience increased traffic as shorter, more cost-efficient routes open up. Yet, due to poor infrastructure, treacherous waters, and a sensitive ecosystem, the Arctic is very vulnerable to marine accidents. You mentioned you think that politics should be separated as much as possible from port management. I was wondering if you believe that the government has any role in encouraging sustainability in Arctic shipping and ports, especially given the lessened scrutiny that accompanies the remote location of some of these ports.
Brilliant question. Yeah. How much time do we have? Remember I made the analogy of the apron strings and the parent? Well, this is a classic case where the government needs to come first and set the fertile ground for this to happen. And you're familiar with the Corridors Initiative? So what the talk is now in Ottawa, or in Upper Canada, as the folks from Newfoundland call it, right? We call it Upper Canada. The Corridors Initiative. So, and basically the Corridors Initiative is the careful placement of resources. Given that the geographical expanse of the Arctic, you cannot put everything. You cannot please everybody and have everything there everywhere that someone wants it, because there's always going to be a limited resource supply. So it's going back to earlier about the best utilization of scarce resources. I mean, that's basic economics. So this is where the government figures out, well, we'll have corridors. So if we can channel, if we have a certain path that we're going to go along, a certain road, a certain highway, then we can build ports there. We can put the navigational infrastructure there. We can do the bathymetry and all this kind of stuff. We can put in all of the services that the ship industry, the shipping industry needs to have to be able to conduct their business and transport in a very safe and environmentally and affordable way. So the government of Canada certainly has to step up to the plate in a big way with infrastructure spending in the Arctic in terms of ports and decide where it is they want the port. So it's just this summer, 2 months ago, they started doing some blasting in Iqaluit. Okay, so that's going to be the first port in the Arctic that's going to be of any except for Churchill, which now has some railroad problems and stuff like that there. But outside of and Tuktoyaktuk, which has a lot of shallow water problems and immense dredging, and with the oil and gas situation in the Arctic right now, Tuktoyaktuk is pretty dormant. But so Iqaluit is the hot spot now. And if you I was here in Halifax a couple of months ago and talking about this, I did a comparison between Greenland ports and Canadian Arctic ports. And if you go to Nuuk, which is only, like, as we say back in Newfoundland, a gunshot across Baffin Bay, I mean, same latitude pretty much. And you go into Nuuk in Greenland, and it's like a first world country, And you go to Iqaluit, and it's like third world country in terms of port development and infrastructure. Right? There's nothing there for the most part. So it can be done. There are some geographical challenges everywhere, yeah, but that's not to say that we can't overcome that kind of stuff in terms of tides and currents and stuff like that. But so I don't know if I'm just babbling on here now or if I'm answering your question. But yes, the government of Canada in terms of politics, not politics, but the government. Yes, separate the politics from the government and do what governments should be doing and not playing politics. Then there's lots of involvement needed for the government of Canada in the Arctic, definitely. Yeah.
Amy McKenzie.
Jim, you should have mentioned about the fantastic meal that you also had in Nuuk as well, the meal and the beer. Yeah, sorry. It's got everything. Yeah.
Did I tell you that story?
No, I was at that meeting.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, we move in the same
meal I've had in
circles.
ages, that's right, yeah. It's fantastic. Yeah.
Let's try to keep focused on ports now.
Well, that was all about ports. It was fantastic. I had to tell you the story eventually. Okay?
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Amy McKenzie. I'm a MA candidate in political science here at Dal. My question's for Tony. Tony, there have been recent policy decisions in Canada that protect marine life over business, including the closing of fishing operations in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, where right whales were spotted last spring,
passing of a bill recently that would ban whale and dolphin captivity. Do you think this is indicative of a shift towards more marine life-friendly policies in Canada that we will see expand in shipping policies, or do you think these decisions are just one-off solutions?
Well, again, notwithstanding, these what you've just talked about primarily are shipping related issues, but where do ports feature in that? Well, that is a good question. I think in terms of just general environmental awareness and things like, mammals in captivity, I think that's on the decline globally. It's probably not a Canadian issue. But one thing I will point out with the Green Marine Program, so just a couple of years ago when I started to pull those data together and look at it in a different way, that's when underwater noise became a new addition to the list. And remember, the program was implemented in 2007. So we knew a lot about underwater noise, and we were at an oil and gas industry off the coast of Nova Scotia for a while, and certainly off Newfoundland. So we knew the issues related to that. But it has just become on the radar. When it comes to port operations and port policy modifying its activities, maybe it's a case of, yes, we'll take large volumes of certain types of shipping traffic, whether it's through the Gulf of St. Lawrence, perhaps at certain times of year. I've not really thought that through yet, because that's a relatively new issue. Just 2 years ago, all of the whales were in the Bay of Fundy, and there were policies in place there for ships to move around and have speed restrictions. Now they're in a new area where ships have been operating and maintaining the status quo. Something needs to change, and whether sometimes that's a case of ports coordinating with ships' arrival time, I think it's a sign of the times. But to be honest, it's probably more adaptive management right now as opposed to being proactive, because who knows, in 2 years' time, based on climate change, those whales might be moving somewhere else for food. So it's really hard to predict that, unfortunately.
Luke Van Horn.
So hi, my name's Luke. I'm a Master's in Public Administration student here at Dalhousie. So my question was going to be for Tony, but it could probably be for Michelle or Tony, so I'm going to break the rules a bit. So the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change estimates that sea levels could rise between 28 to 98 centimeters in the next century. However, some estimates have predicted sea level rise as high as 7 meters. Given that many ports in Canada are located at sea level, that ports contribute greatly to the Canadian economy, and that many remote and island communities, as you mentioned, rely on ports for access to essential goods. Do you know if there are any plans for how ports can handle climate change related challenges such as rising sea levels, and who is accountable for dealing with these challenges?
Can I have a first kick at the can on that?
Yeah.
So, great question. And you know what? Based on the fact that there's government interference on how ports can respond, and we all know that climate change is happening and we need to get things done quickly. As a consultant, before I came to Dal, a lot of my contracts were sole source sometimes on a standing offer to Halifax Port Authority, and they're aware of the problem. As a consultant, I've done risk assessments on what certain infrastructure is more at risk, and let's face it, they're all based at the shoreline, so it's all vulnerable, to be honest. But when it comes to increasing the height of their wharfs and jetties and piers and so on and so forth, they have to go through a whole bunch of additional regulatory permitting processes. And then, of course, SEER 2012 came in. And because they're quasi-federal agencies, they have to then figure out what best management practices they have to incorporate to change this infrastructure. And bearing in mind they are aware of it, but there's delays associated with this. And back in 2014, 2013, one of my last gigs as a consultant was actually helping Halifax Port Authority develop its environmental review checklist, because the SEER screening, which they knew how to do very quickly and very efficiently, that was scrapped along with lots of different SEER projects. So it left a lot of federal agencies, most of them ports, scrambling on knowing what to do. I also did the same type of thing for airports as well, because they're also federally quasi-managed. So to cut to the chase, if they were independent and responding to markets, they would build the wharf tomorrow. If they needed the wharf to accommodate the ships so that they're not going to lose time because of infrastructure damage, they would do it very quickly. But because of the government governance structure, it means they're scrambling to do these things in what I would call real time. But Michelle is a climate change expert, so she has another angle on this as well.
Well, actually, I was going to echo,
Yeah.
because, for example, I have a project doing some work with Port Hawkesbury, interestingly enough, and they're a private operation. The port there, services the industries in the area, in particular the Port Hawkesbury paper and things of that note. And these are things that they just are looking at. They're kind of looking at that forecasting, and the decision is, okay, well, it's they're putting it into their budget of infrastructure improvements, heights, these kinds of things, and also just the strength and robustness because of things like storm surge and increased wind and things like that. And yet at the same time, our CPAs are faced with exactly the same situation but cannot move in the same way. So coming back to kind of my more, I guess, holistic view of the way these things get done, those kinds of things need to be integrated, at a higher level. So, for example, we have a government of Canada saying, okay, climate change is an issue, climate change adaptation, climate change mitigation, these are things we got to consider. But that sits over, in this department, and yet this department over here, who's trying to respond to that, is answerable to somebody else. So there needs to be a lot more coordination in terms of the actions and activities and abilities of our CPAs to move. So that might take some more departments speaking to each other on how we move that forward.
Okay, thank you to the students for the prepared questions. I'm going to open it up to the floor. Are there questions from the floor? We got one at the back here. Sorry. It doesn't amplify. It amplifies around the world because we're live streaming. So that's the purpose. So you have to wait for the microphone. Please introduce yourself.
I'm in the biology department, adjunct professor, and my specialty is whales and underwater noise. And so I am familiar with the Green Marine. I helped was a little tangentially involved in getting the noise issue into the Green Marine program. But I was curious how Halifax, do you know how Halifax does, Tony, specifically on the noise front? And I hope the noise incorporates both the noise in port and the quiet ship in general, because new research is showing that if they have to use their generator in port, then that can attract invasive species onto their hull. There's more biofouling, so it's much more important to get shore-based power also on that front. And also for Jim's question, it's not just the speed, but the fact that the Port of Vancouver is doing giving port fee reductions in quieter ships. That's where ports are pivotal in my mind to quiet to have enough of an incentive for ships to become quieter. But anyway, sorry. How does Halifax?
With respect to Halifax and its performance on ship noise, because it's a relatively recent new addition, and thank you for actually getting it on the list because it's a very important environmental impact. I actually don't know. I'd have to look that up. So maybe it was incorporated in 2016, and I'm assuming the first reporting for that metric would have been in 2017. And in fact, we haven't completed 18. So there must only be one data point. So I don't know where to draw a trend in that, and I also don't know where we scored, to be perfectly honest. But yeah, but I don't know what they've got, whether it's construction noise, blasting in the harbour done at certain times, or whether it's just ships and their operation, and whether they're favouring quieter ships over, let's say, more conventional engine noise.
To my mind, Canada is on the forefront. It's the only country that gives any port reduction for quieter ships at the Port of Vancouver. So that is, no port does that in the world except Vancouver. So we're really on the leading edge there.
Okay, thank you.
Mary, I want to ask you a question. In light of the discussions around government intervention that are necessary for some of these environmental concerns, but your opening foray was the government really needs to be more hands-off in the ports. So was I misinterpreting? Were you persuaded by anything that we talked about here today, or where do you land on all this?
Okay, I think that the governments need to be more clear on what reporting is deemed to be in the national interest, and that reporting should include environmental and corporate social responsibility, not just the economic data. So if you look at what ports, what the government reports now on ports in their annual report, for example, they report things like traffic levels, financial reporting in terms of revenues and expenses. But what they don't have is so I think there is a role for government to set what should be reported, what should be collected, what data is needed, and so on. So it's the teenager is about to leave home, one could, to use Jim's analogy, and the question will be, how much is mom and dad going to put in terms of funds on the table after they're a full-grown adult? And what expectations are going to be put on the table for the reporting of the use of that funds to the public at large? So there is political interference at the moment from the point of view that the minister chooses the appointments and the minister does not enforce compliance completely with the requirements that are already in the Act. So I'm suggesting that there is room for some interference in setting new standards and then walk away.
Michelle, go
If
ahead,
I could
please.
just
Yeah,
very
please go
quickly
ahead.
pick up on that. Tony alluded to this. I mean, there is a standard. It's actually called the Global Reporting Index. I mean, it's an NGO, not-for-profit, that is actually formulated by business. And a number of years ago, they developed essentially a reporting standard. It originally came out just as a generic reporting standard that looks at everything from governance, transparency, environmental, and since in the last 5 or 6 years they've actually started to produce subcategories of indices for specific sectors. And interestingly enough, not long ago they produced a set for airports, and this is a globally accepted reporting standard that is essentially, it's a level playing field, so that if you are doing a GRI standard report in Indonesia or in Denmark or in Brazil, they look exactly the same. So one of the things that we can look to in this is not having to reinvent the wheel. This kind of baseline, kind of globally accepted standard exists already, and you basically just pick up the guide and say, okay, how do we apply this here?
It seemed to me one of the issues that came up, though, was about whether the standards are voluntary or enforced in some capacity. Jim, do you have any thoughts on whether or not we should be enforcing the standards in some of the programs that Tony was talking about, making them mandatory and enforcing them, or whether they have to stay voluntary?
Well,
or any reflections on that particular point?
Yeah, well, in terms of enforcing anything, I mean, what's the end game here? What is it we're trying to do? So voluntary actions can be done rather quickly, and I think a great pilot, a test bed would be to try something voluntary first. So if you look at like the Polar Code, for example, as an example, you have voluntary measures, industry best practices and accepted standards, and then let's see which way the water is flowing once we introduce that. And then if it's flowing in our favor, or if there's some channeling or that's not going in the right direction, then let's, rather than just make it enforcement first and we don't know what the repercussions are going to be, let's do a pilot study first, a test, and see what's going to happen here. So we do some voluntary measures, and then from there then we take the best of that, and then we can make some policy from that there, and some regulation, because it might be harder to turn back the clock once it's in place. And if you're like, ship owners are regulated enough now, right? Don't just be throwing regulation on top of that just for the sake of throwing something else. Know what the result is going to be at the end of this once we do this. How is this going to play out down the chain eventually, right? So think about it before you just act because, it's something nice, we should do this because it appeases a small portion of people and it's political gain somewhere. Stop and think of it and put it down the road all the way and see where it's going to stop at the end of the day.
Anybody want to, we're almost out of time. Does anybody want to comment on this voluntary versus mandatory standards? Any further thoughts on that? Or we're all in agreement?
Well, I'd just like to point out, I think that there's a difference between regulation and reporting. I mean, for example, the government of Canada, is essentially responsible to the taxpayer, and I don't think it's that inappropriate for the taxpayer to say, we want to know how you spend your money and what you're doing. So, for example, coming back to this GRI, I mean, it doesn't actually say, what your levels have to be. It doesn't say you have to, put in this kind of fuel. It doesn't say you have to behave in this kind of way. It just provides you the metrics to say, here's the check, here you're just tell us what you're doing. If the answer is we're not doing it, well, that's fine. Well, it's not fine, but it's at least tell us you're not doing it. So I think that's the thing, is expecting the reporting. I'm more inclined to say, you know what, yeah, we expect that. Whereas the regulatory kind of the what you have to do, I'm more inclined on the voluntary side for that.
One of the principles under the Toronto Stock Exchange requirement for publicly traded companies in this country is that these are the rules, but the rules are voluntary. If you choose to report, we're pleased. If you choose not to do this, then you have to explain why not, or investor interests are not protected. I see nothing wrong with voluntary. You got it. You report it. If you choose not to report it, then the requirement is you explain why you're not reporting it. And we don't have that now. And I would think that the port sector would be well served to have suggestions on what should be reported. It's voluntary. If you don't, please explain why you're not. It's the why. If you understand the motivation, then you're good.
Tony, you started all the trouble with the voluntary in the first place.
Yeah.
The last word is to you.
Well, enforcement, governments don't like doing it. Ship owners or ports probably don't like having regulations forced upon them. But what if you've got a good system of voluntary reporting, no matter what that is, and we've talked about many different opportunities and schemes, I think once the information's out there, let stakeholders, the public, maybe consumers of these products make an informed decision then, and then you can compare, especially if it's listed or ranked in some way, who is doing the best of the rest, and then maybe you can at least then choose to do business with somebody that you're probably proud to do business with, or share the same kind of principles. So anyway, just getting the information out there and let stakeholders make an informed decision, and that could drive the market.
Great, thank you so much. We ran a couple of minutes late. We started a couple of minutes late, so I took a liberty there. As is the custom, we will present the panelists with a token of appreciation after the roundtable at the MacEachen Institute this afternoon. For the time being, please join me in thanking the panel for an outstanding discussion tonight.